Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Jeff Lyons, founder of Storygeeks and Storygeeks.com, and this video is one that I've wanted to do for a while. It's going to be fairly short, but it's a very important topic because I find that a lot of writers, especially novelists, have a hard time with this question. And it seems like this question would be pretty obvious, who's your protagonist? How do you find the protagonist? And again, this question seems, well, duh. There are a lot of confusions about this because people don't have any roadmap really for figuring out who the main character is. Either there is no main character in their mind, or there are lots of main characters. Very often it's obvious who the main protagonist is, especially in a movie or a TV show or something like that. But for novelists, it's a bit of a conundrum. For an example of this is George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series. Those books don't have main characters. There's a series of dramatic lines that are converging in book to book to book and will eventually someday culminate in the last book. But they're all separate POV character chapters in those books, and there's no one person that you're following who's the quote main character. Now, he can get away with that because of how he's writing the books. It's a huge story space. So this is one of the advantages that writers have of novels, is that you have such a large story space, you can get away with not being super focused about this sometimes. But you've got to be, there's a lot of landmines. You've got to be very careful. You're not going to lose the reader's interest or focus because they don't know who to focus on, But Martin's books does a brilliant job of holding your attention as the reader and getting around the problem of not really having a main character for each of the books. The first book can arguably, the Game of Thrones book can arguably be said to be Ned Stark's story. But all the other ones, not so much. There's no real focus. So it can be pulled off. It can happen. It can work. You can not have to answer the question, but you better be a damn good writer and you better be really good at story structure to be able to pull that off. And most writers aren't. They're not that good with story structure. They're not that good with the basic deploying of a broad story world that they can make that happen and have it be convincing and stay convincing. So that's what this video is really kind of trying to address. How do you find a protagonist if you in fact need or want one? And in your gut, you've got one, but you don't quite know who it might be. Well, like I said, there are the obvious signposts on this. Okay. Very often, especially if you're writing a first-person story, it's going to be the person telling the story. I'm not talking about a narrator maybe telling somebody else's story who is actually the main character. I'm talking about a first-person point of view story where it's very obvious that we're spending all of our time with the dramatic focus of the story. Okay, so that's one situation where you don't have to think too hard on this one. It's the POV. The POV character is the first-person POV character telling the story. Another clear signpost is when you have like a team story, like a sports story or a military story where there's the troop or the whatever, the leader of the pack, right? I have in my little ebook on how to write large casts. I think Rapid Story Development ebook number 4. I talk about the difference between ensemble stories and team stories. And team stories is what most people are writing when they're writing large cast stories. And there's usually somebody that rises to the top of the team, who's the leader, who's the POV character, and is the main character of the team story. Like the Expendables movies and all that kind of stuff. Um, so it's obvious in those contexts who the main character is. The POV character is the leader of the pack. Okay. In a TV show, especially if it's a big ensemble cast and you're telling lots of different stories every season for different every episode within a season for every character in the show, the main character is the star of the show. That's how TV shows get made. That's how TV shows get sold. They have to have a star. Okay, so that's your main character. Even though each episode might feature a different character as we're telling their subplots, as we're getting into the individual backstories and origin stories of the different characters, that's another way to drive stories forward in a TV show. But you'll always have that main character who's the star of the show. Okay, that's your main character. Okay, so those are three scenarios where it's really obvious who the main character is going to be. But like I say, what do you do when you have a story that's a large cast or there's lots of people and they all have pretty much the same dramatic weight throughout the story? How do you know who's the main character? Okay. So some of the mistakes people make when they're faced with this situation, and novelists in particular run into this problem. Okay. But some of the mistakes people make is well, you just make everybody the main character. You just have everybody be the protagonist. You got multiple protagonists. I hear this all the time. I've got multiple protagonists. Well, chances are no, you don't. Everybody might have a very strong sameness about their dramatic impact in the story and the weight that they're dealing with dramatically. And so you can't really distinguish necessarily, but I will guarantee you, almost guarantee you, one of them is more central than the others. And we're going to talk about that at the very end of the video, the 3 core questions you ask to find out who your protagonist is. But this is the easy way out for a lot of writers. Well, I'll just make everybody the protagonist. No, that's not what you do. What you end up when you do that, what you end up with is a defocused story, unless you can pull it off like George Martin. Most people aren't going to be able to do that. And the consequence will be the reader won't know where to focus their attention dramatically. They're not going to buy into anybody necessarily. Oh, maybe they'll buy into everybody. Well, maybe. But you're going to have to pull that off. That's really hard to do. And the chances are you really do have a main character in there. You just haven't found them. Okay. So making everybody a main character because it's too hard to figure it out isn't the answer. Okay. So rather than you taking the easy way out, okay, I'm going to just let the reader make the choice. Let them have that. They're the reader. They get to decide who's the most important character in the story. They're going to choose who the protagonist is. That's a disaster waiting to happen. Okay. Talk about not knowing what to do. You're just going to piss readers off more than not. If you're going to just forfeit that creative responsibility and push that off on the reader and let them handle it. No, they're not going to like that, and it's not going to work. Okay. The other way people deal with this is, well, I'm going to write it the way I'm going to write it. Everyone's going to have equal dramatic weight, and the story's going to tell me who the protagonist is. They're going to rise to the top in the writing. Okay. This is an octave of what I did on another video, which you might want to check out. I'm going to try to put a little link up here somewhere, to the myth that stories and characters write themselves. No, no, and no. The characters will not rise to the top unless you push them there. Okay, that's how it really happens. So this is just another way of you avoiding the responsibility of having to make the creative choices to decide who the story's about and who the main character is. No, the character's not going to rise to the top. Unless you have a scenario like we talked earlier on, where it's obvious who the protagonist is because of how you're telling the stories as a first-person POV, or it's the leader of the pack, or et cetera, et cetera. Then you don't have to do the heavy lifting. You have a story already in your mind that has a very clear trajectory for a POV character, which is great. Okay. But if you don't have that situation, any of those easy situations, if it's unclear who it is, taking this particular approach of just letting them rise to the top, that's another way of you just not taking responsibility for your job. Okay. This is something you've got to figure out. Okay. So, how do you figure this out? What do you do? Okay, there's actually a fairly straightforward solution to this problem of trying to find who your protagonist is when you're not clear and you're just unsure. Okay, there's three questions you ask. Okay, who is in the most emotional pain? Who has the most to lose? And who is going to change the most? Those three questions will solve the problem. So let's look at them one at a time. Okay. Who is in the most emotional pain? Well, what does that mean? Most emotional pain. Well, I think we all intuitively know what it means to be in emotional pain. I don't really have to get into that, right? You know, you could have a character who is facing a scenario where they're about to lose a child. Okay. And another character who's in the same story who's about to lose their house. Which one's in the most emotional pain? Well, it could be the one in the house, or it could be the one who's going to lose the kid. How do you decide? You'll know the context of your story. Which of those two setups is going to be the most emotionally wrenching for most human beings? Probably losing a child. Okay, so if you have two characters facing painful situations, it's really not going to be that hard to figure out who is in the most emotional pain. They're dealing with the most consequential and difficult emotional consequences. Okay? But there is a situation, could be scenarios and situations where, excuse me, you just really can't tell the difference. Two characters are both losing children. Which one's in the most emotional pain? Oh, gosh, I don't know. They're both in pain. Okay, so then you go to the next question. Who has the most to lose, emotionally or materially or both? Okay, so let's just review stakes. Okay, story stakes, dramatic stakes. The definition of story stakes. Okay, something is going to be won, something is going to be lost, either emotionally or materially, or both. There are consequences to the winning or the losing. In other words, if the character wins something, they get something. If the character loses something, they lose something. That has story consequences and emotional consequences for the character. Next, the consequences become ever more consequential as the story moves forward. In other words, you ratchet up the stakes, you raise the stakes, and the way you raise the stakes is by always creating more and more consequential consequences. Stuff that's going to happen because of the winning and the losing becomes ever more impactful to the plot and to the emotional life of the character. That's what story stakes are. That's how you move them forward at a very high level. Okay. We're not getting into the nitty gritty of technique and how you do that. That's just functionally what stakes are and what the role they play in a dramatic story. Okay. So for the purposes of this second question, who's got the most to lose? That's what you look at. What are the story stakes? Who has the most emotionally or the most materially or both to lose overall in the story? Oh gosh, I just don't know. It's everybody's going to lose about the same amount of things, and I'm still not clear. It's all a fog. It's they're all in the same emotional pain. They're all have the same stakes. I don't get it. I don't. Okay. The third question is the one that will pop it for you. Okay. I mean, chances are the first question is going to have a very clear response. And if not that, the second one will have a very clear response. Okay, almost always, 9 times out of 10. But there's always that one situation where maybe, oh God, I don't know. So you go to the third question. Who is going to change the most? Well, they're all going to change. Everybody's going to change in the story. Yeah, that's a good thing. If you've got lots of characters changing in a story, that's really great for dramatic tension, for giving you subplots. That's great. But I will guarantee you one of them changes the most. And what does change mean? It doesn't mean, well, they changed their clothes. Well, it doesn't mean they buy a different car. Well, no, it doesn't. No, it means emotionally they go from one emotional space to another that defines them as a person. They heal an emotional wound that is the basis of what's moving them, what I call that moral component. They heal that moral component. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then check out Anatomy of a Premise Line, my book on that whole topic. Chapter 7 talks about how to build a moral problem for a story and what that even means. That's the change. They go from being one kind of an emotional person to a different kind of emotional person, and they change. And because of that change, they win the day, or maybe they don't, but they're different. Okay. One person's going to do that more than any other character in the story. Okay. Whether or not all the characters have the exact same stakes, whether or not they're all in the same level of emotional pain, one of them is going to have the most distinctive, the most dramatically interesting, and the most satisfying emotional shift at the end of the story. If you have a story and not a situation, a whole other video I need to do, defining what a situation is versus a story. But assuming you've got a story, you're telling us something about the human condition. Okay, any character on a journey of change, which is how you define a story, one character will fulfill that last question. Boom, you're done. You got your answer. Well, oh my gosh, they're all in emotional pain. They've all got stakes and they're all going to change exactly the same way. If you think that's not something someone's going to say, think again. I've heard it many times. If you find yourself in a situation where all 3 questions just cannot be answered, you're probably playing a game with yourself. Sorry, but you are. Okay. You need to just back off, take a deep breath, revisit your story at some point where you're not in anxiety and frustration and anger about not being able to find the answers to these questions, and review this, or bump it up against somebody else who you respect, have them answer the questions based on their understanding of your story, and see if they feel the exact same way you do. Chances are they won't. Okay, so Just know you're probably playing a game with yourself, trying to avoid the answer for some reason. Now, why would you do that? Who knows? I don't know. But I've seen writers in this situation. Sometimes it's just because they just tie themselves into story knots and they can't see the forest for the trees. These questions actually help you get through the weeds and the underbrush. Okay. So, who's in the most emotional pain? Who has the most to lose emotionally or materially? And who is going to change the most? Are the three questions you have to ask and answer. And when you do, you will find your protagonist for any story in any genre. Okay. The next video related to this is, how do you find your central opposition, your main opponent, the main bad guy gal? How do you know who they are? That's going to be a whole other video, and that's a really interesting one. But in this one, this is how you answer the question, and this will get you where you want to go. I hope this was helpful. I will see you in class, or I'll see you in consulting, or I'll see you in another video. Thank you for your time.